Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining this DynamicsCon session. Today we're going to be looking at the top 10 security gotchas in Dynamics 365 for finance and operations. And the idea here is that we don't want to be a gotcha going forward. Let me introduce myself. My name is Alex Meyer. I'm the director of Dynamics AX and 365 F&O development at FastPath. FastPath does a lot of work within the areas of security, audit, and compliance across a number of different ERPs. But my area in particular is within Dynamics AX and F&O. My contact information is up there at the top. I do have a Dynamics 365 blog that I write about that's completely educational about things that I find within security. My background is I've been within the dynamic space since 2013, obviously specifically around the areas of security, audit, and compliance. I do have a Microsoft MVP award in business applications. And I've presented at a number of Dynamics communities, user group events, Summit North America and Europe, user group focus, things like that. Other areas or other conferences and user groups around this topic and others. So what are we going to be covering today? We're going to be looking at, I know that the session is labeled the top 10, but I actually have 11 security gotchas that I want to go through today. So the agenda here is literally going through those different 11 areas. We're going to be looking at things like how hard security is in AX and F&O, the priority of security within a project team, whether an upgrade or implementation, where security actually falls at within your organization, who has control of it, where segregation of duties are done at, where, how we actually look at segregation of duties during our security design, as well as process controls and mitigations to help with those. Where security is actually going to be stored within your environment, whether it's, you're creating it from the user interface or the AOT. The fact that least privilege security is normally not implemented or designed for when you're setting up your security, where users' temporary role access becomes permanent. Things like dilution of go-live security, if you're not doing periodic reviews, and then deploying security without following ALM. So that's just a high-level overview of the things we're going to cover today. Let's go ahead and jump into that first area, and we'll kind of work our way down this list through the rest of the session. So the first one that we're talking about is this idea that Dynamics AX and F&O security is hard. And the idea here is that it's hard for everyone. You're not alone in the fact that if you've tried to go in and set up security before and you think that it's hard or that it's very difficult to do, that's not just you, it's hard for everybody. And that's just the nature of the beast when we're looking at AX and F&O security. Along with that, there's limited understanding of the security model and framework. That's something that I found getting into this area, that there wasn't really a whole lot of documentation around certain areas, especially the more advanced areas of security. And that's one of the reasons why I started my blog, to help get that information out there. And then along with that, because of the complexity of it and the limited understanding and resources out there for it, it's easy to get frustrated, which leads to a number of other areas that we're going to cover today. Things like over-provisioning users, assigning sysadmin, things like that. There are resources to help you with this, one of them being my blog, another one being Dynamics community forums, as well as the documentation area for the application itself. And so, it's very easy to go in and just say security is hard. And you just have to remember and keep in mind that there are resources to help you along with this. Next thing we're going to talk about is this idea that security is a low priority for the project team. So whether you're going through an implementation or an upgrade, it's very easy for security to get pushed down to the very bottom. It's not something that is fun to do. It's not something that is going to get an ROI for your team, immediately. But there are things that are tied to this, including user license costs and the cost of having to go in and mitigate or provide some process control for segregation of duties, that are hidden benefits of actually prioritizing security. Dynamics 365, F&O, and the earlier versions, Dynamics AX, are unique in the ERP space where your user licenses are going to be tied directly to security. So if you can set up your security correctly, you have the potential of saving your company a large sums of money in licensing costs And so that can be an ROI for that investment of actually going in and setting up your security correctly. Another thing that comes into this is that, you may get to the last week, maybe 2 weeks, maybe in a month of your implementation or upgrade. And all of a sudden, people start realizing that don't really have your security set up correctly. And so, you can very easily run out of time trying to do that. And so, obviously, if you're going in and doing it correctly, it can take multiple hours per role to get it set up correctly, going through the design phase, the development phase, and then user acceptance testing of your security. And so you want to make sure that you're budgeting enough time when you're going in and doing that project to actually get your security set up. The other thing is that, if you do run out of time, or, maybe you don't even really spend any time setting up security, then the one thing that you can do here is just use out of the box security that Microsoft provides. And while that may seem like a good idea initially, as you get into this and start looking at it, you're going to realize very quickly that the out of the box security over provisions users for what they actually probably need to do in the system. And that can lead to segregation of duties risks that you may not have really thought about, just from the fact that Microsoft has developed these roles from a functional standpoint and not an SOD standpoint. So they want to try to give you as much functionality in the system for those areas that the role has access to, and not really caring about what the SOD side would be. The next one is a really big one that we see as well. A lot of times during an implementation or upgrade, the project leader or your project manager will go ahead and take security and put it into the domain of your IT team, or your security sysadmin team to handle. And again, while that may seem like a good idea initially, the IT team normally probably doesn't have any idea what a user should have access to. Now, they do have the ability to actually, they probably have the necessary access to go in and actually set up security, whether that's from the AOT or the user interface. They probably have the necessary permissions and rights to actually go in and do that, but they don't really know what any user should have access to in the system. And so that's where your business process owners or managers come into play, in that they know what a user should have access to within the system, but they don't really have the knowledge or the permissions within the environment to actually go in and configure security. And so there has to be communication between your IT sysadmin team and your business process owners to actually, go in and actually set up security correctly. And the implementations and upgrades that we've seen, or that I have seen personally that have been successful, have this great communication between these two teams. And so that's something that's critical when you're going in and trying to set up security correctly. The next thing is this idea of segregation and duties analysis. And so, depending on your organization, whether you're, public or private, or whether you're just trying to have the best, best security practices for your private organization as well, you want to keep in mind the idea of the segregation of duties and how they're analyzed within Microsoft Dynamics 365 for finance and operations. So there is a native tool for Microsoft that you can actually go in through the system and set up your SOD analysis there. But the analysis that's done is going to be done at the duty level. So the idea here is that you go in and set up your conflict between duty 1 and duty 2. If a user has access to both of those, that's going to be considered a conflict. And again, this is one of those areas where that seems like a good idea when you're first looking at it, but then when you really start digging into it and you start getting into security, you know that there are privileges underneath those duties, there are objects underneath those privileges. And so the idea of doing your segregation and duties at the duty level leaves a lot of gaps where you can have false positives or false negatives. And it also leads to what I call security churn, in that you have to revalidate your rule set every time security is changed at a duty or privilege level. So if you go in and make a change to duty or privilege, you have to revalidate your entire rule set to determine whether or not the rules that you have set up are still valid. And so, those two areas kind of make it so that it's very difficult to use that out of the box system if you do have a high level of requirements from an audit perspective for segregation of duties. Realistically, if you do have some sort of audit requirement, your SOD should be done at the object level. And by object, and within F&O, we're talking about the table, menu item, identity, service operation level, because by doing it at that level of detail, that's going to remove the false positives and false negatives that you would have had doing that analysis at the duty level. And then once your rule set is actually set, it doesn't matter what changes are going to be done to your security, whether at a role, duty, or privilege level, because you're analyzing it at the object level. That's really going to make it so that it, changes to security don't impact your rule set in that way. At the bottom here, I just took a screenshot of me going in and actually setting up using the native SOD tool from Microsoft and setting up a rule here at the top between vendor master and bank account. So you can see that we're able to go in. Our first duty here is maintain vendor master. Our second duty is maintain bank account master. You have a severity and a security risk, which is basically a description of that. And then a mitigation that you're going to use. Conflict, you can see the role that she's actually getting that from each side. So she's getting maintain vendor master from the accounting manager role and the maintain bank accounts master from the treasurer role. And so then at that point, you have the ability to decide whether or not she should have that. And then if you still want her to have access to both of those roles, you can provide a reason for your override, and she would be able to be assigned that. Otherwise, what would happen is during the assignment of that role, or either one of the roles that would cause a conflict, it would actually stop and be a preventative control from that user being assigned that. All right, the next one we're going to look at is normally during a setup when you're doing your security design, actually trying to develop your segregation duties conflicts or keeping those in mind during that process doesn't really happen. And so you want to make sure that during your security design, you're considering which tasks the user should perform in their day-to-day operations. You can do things like the business process design mapping or documentation, whether you're doing that through Visio or some other process, or the user role assignment. And then thinking about which combinations of these tasks actually cause a financial risk. And by doing that, what you're actually doing is you're creating your, or starting down the path of creating your rule set that you can use for your segregation duties conflicts. And so by limiting access to the system through the user role assignment, I put in quotes here, least privilege, to only the tasks the user needs, you can actually cut down on the number of SOD risks. And we'll get into the least privilege part a little bit later. But the idea here is that if you can limit access that a user actually has in the system, you're inherently going to cut down in the number of SOD risks that they have, and therefore the number of mitigations you have to provide for those as well. One thing to keep in mind is that every environment is going to have SOD risks. It's not really feasible in really any organization, unless you're very, very large, to have true segregation of duties. The goal here is to minimize your SOD risks through security design, as well as process controls and mitigations. And so you're never going to get to zero segregation duties conflicts. You just want to try to minimize those and then have mitigations or process controls for those that you can't get rid of. And we kind of talk about here at the bottom that getting to zero SOD conflicts within an organization isn't really feasible, because you're either going to run out of time going through and performing that, you're going to run out of resources, in this case, people normally, or money as you go through this process. And so it's not really feasible to go through and do that for any organization, unless you're extremely large, to go and get that zero SOD conflicts. All right, the next one kind of ties into the segregation and duty side, and I kind of mentioned it. The idea that you want to develop your process controls and mitigations as part of your security design as well. When you're actually looking at, like we talked about, it's not feasible to eliminate that SOD risk. So you want to have a plan in place to actually have process controls and mitigations to deal with those SOD risks that you can't get rid of. There are many different options to actually, when you're going through and setting up mitigations or process controls, right? You can go in and you can modify a role, duty, or privilege that a user is assigned, actually change the security so the user no longer has one or more of the roles. duties or privileges that are causing a conflict. You can go in and modify the role assignment. So you can actually remove the role access from the user and remove that access to that conflict. Or you may provide a process control or mitigation, right? So if you can't remove the security from the user, this is where that process control or mitigation comes into play. And in this case, when we talk about process controls or mitigations, the idea here is that that control can either stop the user from performing one or more parts of the SOD risk, or have some sort of review of the user having that access, whether that's manager approval, transaction sampling, things like that. So, one of those two options is normally what your process control or mitigation is going to be. All right, the next one that we're going to look at is going to be user access being over-provisioned. And this is one, again, that's going to lead into other points here, but the idea that because security is hard, because it's complicated to set up, it's very easy to go in and just start, throwing roles at a user to see if they can do what you need them to do, or in a very extreme case, use a sysadmin role that I have listed here to actually make sure the user can perform what you need them to do. And I have that listed as an easy out because it is, but that's happened more times than I can count over, through the many customers and clients that we've dealt with. Obviously, like I mentioned, these tend to happen because, you can't figure out the correct security settings, because things like security is one option here is that because security is hard, users can't perform the process they need. Time equals money, right? If user can't get orders out the door, and that's costing you, getting those orders out on time, that's costing you money. Obviously, you're going to hear the phrase, give them the access they need from, some manager. And then at that point, if your sysadmin or whoever is assigning security is probably going to I apologize, or either going to come in and, grant them sysadmin access or over grant them role access from there. One thing I will say is that the sysadmin, if you are using that for a number of different users, that is one of the first report that auditors will ask for, whether that's who's assigned sysadmin or what are they doing with their access. Both of those are very, very important to auditors. So if you do have an internal, external auditor, and you are overutilizing the sysadmin role, that's something that will come back in your audit reports and make it very difficult to get past your audit. So we talked about this idea of least privilege security in a couple different places before, but we haven't really defined that yet. And so one of the gotchas that I wanted to go over was this idea that least privilege security isn't being utilized or implemented during your security design. So the first thing that we want to actually do is define the least privilege security. And so when we talk about that, what we're actually saying is we wanted to determine the least amount of access that a user needs for their day-to-day activities, right? That's the end goal. We're trying to get them to only be assigned access that they need, nothing more. And that's the idea of least privilege security. When you're actually developing security, there are actually three different options when you're going in and setting this up. You can take a top-down approach. When we consider top-down, we're talking about taking out-of-the-box roles, duties, and privileges and removing access from those until you actually get to this least privilege idea. You have the bottom-up approach where you're actually developing your security from the ground up to be least privilege. So that's why I marked it there. But the idea that you're only assigning the access that each role, duty, and privilege needs. And then you have this idea of a hybrid approach. And so the reason I put that out there is that while it may sound like a good idea to only do bottom-up approach from a least privilege perspective, that process does take a lot of time. It does take a lot of resources, and it does take a lot of knowledge of how to set up security correctly. And so a lot of organizations don't really have the resources to actually go in and set that up. Set all of their security from a bottom-up approach. And so what you can do is actually designate certain areas of your system to be higher risk and actually set up least privilege security for those high risk areas using least privilege. And then for areas that maybe you don't fall under the scope of audit, or maybe don't have the same risk level, maybe they're a low risk area, then you could use a top-down approach or actually just use out-of-box security in those areas because, there's no financial impact of risk to your organization by giving a user access to that. And so with that, you talk about, why is it important to use least privilege security? And we kind of talked about all of these in separate areas, but to really bring the point home, the first point is being environmental risk, right? If a user has more access than they need, then they can intentionally or unintentionally or inadvertently actually go in and perform actions that could put your company at risk, right? They may not know, for example, what the ramifications of turning a setting on or off would be, or changing a fiscal calendar, or posting this particular check, like what the impact of that would be. And so what you can do is, if you remove that security from that user, right, they don't have the ability to actually go in and perform that task. And obviously, if users intentionally going into making those changes that could put your company at risk, that's another reason why you want to lock that down. From the licensing perspective, again, we talked about where licensing is tied to your security. And so if you're taking your least privilege access, you're also making it so that you're minimizing your licensing costs. And so this is the big one that we talk about later when we're talking about ROI of actually setting up least privilege security and trying to get your higher ups to actually buy into this process, is that you can very quickly say, here's the amount of money we're going to be saving on licensing costs, or here's the, estimated costs we're going to be saving if we actually go through and set up our security correctly. And then the last one with segregation duties, kind of the same idea as environmental risk, but if you're taking that security away from a user, they're going to have the least amount of SOD violations that they can have to actually perform their day-to-day operations. And you don't have to actually go in and mitigate those conflicts as well. So you're saving money in both identifying your segregation duties as well as addressing those segregation duties. So I do have a completely separate session on how to actually go up and implement least privilege security, but here's the high level overview of how to go in and do that. The first step would be to actually determine a task the user will perform, obviously making sure you don't want to over provision the user. That kind of defeats the purpose. We have some free resources from FastPath to help with this if you would like, one of them being the security matrix. The next thing is you want to actually isolate those menu items from the process or task. And the reason for that is because your menu items are driving your table level access within F&O. And so if you can identify which menu items are actually being used, that kind of drives the rest of your security. There are a couple different ways to go about doing this. The easiest one is actually to use the task recorder functionality, which is native to F&O, and allows you to actually record a user performing a task in the user interface and actually capture what that user does. That task recorder functionality is normally used for documentation or testing purposes, but a byproduct of that is that it can actually, or does actually capture the menu items that are actually consumed during that process. So if you can analyze those correctly, those task recordings, you can actually pull out the menu items that are being used. And so there's a feature within F&O called the security diagnostics for task recordings that you can use. I also wrote a separate tool called the task recorder parser that's available on my GitHub page to actually, you can go and use as well. There are some things you have to watch out for that I've written about on my blog when you're using that. But overall, one of those two options will get you to actually be able to pull those out. The next thing is actually determine the correct permissions for those menu items. And this is another area where we talk about your menu item security is being honored at that table level within F&O. And so, sometimes that's going to be fairly straightforward, right? If you're going in and creating a vendor, obviously you probably need to have create permission to those certain menu items. But if you're taking a more complex task recording and trying to analyze it, right, that can make it a little bit more difficult. We do have, again, resources to help you at FastPath if you would like. But otherwise, it's going to have to be something where you manually go in and set those that security level. Obviously, step 4 is more geared towards AX2012, but there are also going to be times when you need to allow or restrict access to certain tables and fields. And then finally, you want to make sure you test and validate, right? Always be sure that you're testing that solution prior to deploying it, because we want to make sure that that security is correct before it goes into our solution. And one thing that I will point out here is that users normally will not complain about having too much access, but they will complain about not having enough. All right. So the next gotcha that I want to talk about is this idea of where security is actually stored. And so when we talk about this, this is going to be one of the biggest changes if you're coming from AX 2012 to F&O from a security standpoint. This is going to be one of the bigger changes because with an AX 2012, if you went in and made a change to security, you were always making it in the AOT, and it would automatically get pushed back as part of your code, and you can use your source control system to actually control that. Now, because of the split between where your design time and your runtime is, your security is split up on how it's stored as well. So if you make a change, for example, in the AOT to security, that's actually going to be stored as code in XML format within certain folders within your solution, and actually be stored in there as the security data will actually be stored in that XML. If you make a change to security through the user interface, it actually doesn't get stored as code. It actually gets stored as data within the database in certain tables. And again, it's being stored in that XML format, but it's being stored as data. So when the security framework comes along and actually looks to see what security is actually being or should be assigned, it's actually going to come in and look at the AOT first, and then come in and actually look at the user interface and see if there's anything that modifies that security. And your user interface is going to normally or will win out in that case if there are conflicting changes going on. And so you want to make sure that you know, one, where your security changes are being done, because that's going to dictate how they're stored. And two, you want to make sure that if you are making changes in both the AOT and user interface, you have a way to actually combine those and have them move forward into your other environments, right? So if you're making changes in a dev environment from the AOT and user interface side, you have to make sure that there's a way, either through process or through where you're going in and moving your AOT over first and then your user interface, or have a way to actually move your user interface changes back to the AOT and have it be code moving forward. And so I have another solution to actually help with that on my GitHub, the security converter that I mentioned, and we also have it at FastPath as well. But the GitHub projects are going to be free for you to go and use. That actually help move that user interface data, security data, back to your AOT to make it a part of your code solution. And therefore you could move it between environments the same way you would code. The next security gotcha, and one that happens quite often again, is this idea that your temporary users are assigned temporary access for whatever reason, that ends up becoming permanent. Obviously, your temporary access can happen for any number of reasons, right? If you have a firefighter emergency access need, then the user needs to be elevated and maybe their access doesn't get taken away. Employee vacation, where somebody else has to cover for them. Same thing for sick leave. Contractors are another big one, where you have a temporary user coming on for 3 months maybe, or whatever that time frame is. And then the last one is employee termination, making sure that you're actually terminating that access when an employee leaves the organization. So how to address this? There's really no native functionality to go in and actually do these user access periodic reviews, but it must be a manual process to actually go in and revoke this access. And so we talk about how to actually build out that periodic review and another gotcha coming up here. But you want to make sure you have some process as part of that, whatever the revocation process is, that you actually have a process to go in and remove that. And the next one that we talk about here is the dilution of go live security. So if you've done everything right up until this point, if you're not doing periodic reviews of your user access and role access security, it's all going to be for naught, because over time, your security is going to change, whether you're adding new users, whether you're adding new modules to F&O that you're using, whether your business processes are changing, right? There are going to be things that occur, events that occur within your organization that are going to require you to actually review that access and make sure it's still correct. So you want to make sure, regardless of what that time frame is, whether it's every quarter, twice a year, once a year, whatever that is, that you're going in and actually validating that user access and role access is correct. And you want to make sure that you're taking a risk-based approach to that, right? Not every area in your system is going to be at the same risk level. And so you want to make sure that you're reviewing those high-risk areas much more closely, those users that have high-risk access much more closely than other users. And so you want to make sure that if you go in and do this, you're going to ensure that your go-live security stays at the same level all throughout your usage of the product. All right, and finally here, where the final one we're going to talk about is this idea, the final gotcha is deploying security. And so I get a lot of questions about how do I actually deploy security? How do I migrate it between environments? And the one thing you want to keep in mind here is that you want to treat your security as code. So just like you wouldn't let somebody go in to your production instance and make a code change right on the fly, you shouldn't be allowing users to go into your production and make security changes in that way either. They should be going through your normal dev process, just like you would for code, and have it follow the same process. So instead of looking like the user on the left that's going to each environment and deploying the security individually, you should be doing it like the user on the right and actually deploying it or creating it and designing it in dev, having it roll up to your test, UAT, QA, and then finally being promoted to production as well. And there's some great articles that I've included in the notes section of this deck about from Microsoft employees about how to set up an ALM or application lifecycle management story using source control, using those features that Microsoft has been working really hard on, like Azure DevOps, things like that, to help move the security between environments. All right, so what can be done to not be a gotcha, right? We went through all these different areas. We talked about certain things you should look out for. You know, what can we do to actually make sure that we're not going to be a gotcha when we're looking through security or setting up, reviewing, going through the entire security process. The first thing to do is to look for resources, hopefully free, but resources in general surrounding security. You want to make sure you start early and start often. And what we mean by that is that your security should be, if you have it, be a part of every part of your implementation process. Every time you're doing a module, every time you're doing, you know, some new feature or functionality that you're adding into your either upgrade or implementation phase, you should also make sure that security is a part of that. If you do that and you start early in that process and start often by making sure that it's brought up and that people are actually doing it, that's going to also make sure that security stays at the forefront of your process as it's going through its upgrade or implementation. Your security design and process controls and mitigations should all be done together, right? When you're designing security, you should be looking out for SODs, conflicts, as well as designing and developing your process controls and mitigations for those. If you're doing all three of those together, that makes that process much easier to do, and it's not, you know, a huge mountain to try and climb to go back through it. Again, when you're studying your security, really can't be a siloed project, right? It can't just be dumped into the domain of IT or your business process owners or your sysadmins, right? It really needs to be a combination of those areas of your business because that's going to give you that best cohesiveness between it, because you're going to have your IT sysadmin teams that have the ability to make changes to security, and your business side actually setting it knows what that user should have access to. And I will say that successful projects normally have either a go-to person or team for security that, you know, you can always go to for, you know, recommendations or to help set up security, whatever it is. If you have a go-to person or team, that's going to help with that. I kind of talked about this before, but you want to take that risk-based approach and identify high-risk areas of your business. And this is about setting up security, a bunch of different areas of things that we went through. But if you can identify those high-risk areas of your business, that's going to help determine where your SOD conflict should be and where you should focus your security efforts. Determine which security design methodology you want to use, right? Are you going to use top-down, or you use bottom-up, or are you going to do a hybrid? I would probably recommend going in and looking at that hybrid approach and using that least privilege or bottom-up security when you're dealing with high-risk areas of your business. Understanding that security is not a one-time exercise, right? You can't just design it, create it once and ship it and never have it change. Because it's a living, breathing thing. You want to make sure that you're taking the time to do those reviews, and taking the risk-based approach to your reviews, looking at those high-risk areas, having your business process owners doing those reviews, and then updating your SOD rules and your process controls as your security changes, right? So making sure that those all match up. Have a process for user role assignments, right? Going through it, and should it be temporary? Should it be permanent? Is there a process for removing it if it's temporary? And does the assignment of this new security for this user actually create SOD conflicts, right? And if it does, do you have process controls around those areas, around those new conflicts that have been created for that user? And then again, keeping in mind that how you're designing security, where you're making those changes is actually impacting how that security is stored and how you need to migrate that security between environments, how you should go about it. And so just keeping that in mind as you're designing your security. And then finally, that you should deploy and migrate your security like you would code. Again, going through the same process you would for code, going from dev to UAT, test, QA, and finally production. So at the end of the deck here, I've also included some more resources for that. So with that, I will want to go ahead and thank you all for joining this. I hope you have a great rest of your DynamicsCon, and thank you again for joining the session. Make sure you guys stay tuned for a Q&A session immediately following the presentation.